Good day and welcome to this fourth in a series of discussions of how we came to have the Book of Common Prayer. Its compilation in the time of the Reformation and its transition down to us through the succeeding centuries. As I ended the discussion of the previous century, by the year 1700 there were Anglicans who were writing commentaries on the Book of Common Prayer. I mentioned Robert Nelson and his commentary on the festivals and fasts of the Prayer Book, a very popular book which went through numerous editions. There were other individuals who were writing commentaries on it as well, and this century included one by the name of Wheatley. And also there was Archdeacon Stanhope's, or Dean Stanhope's, series of sermons on the Collects, Epistles, and Gospels of the Prayer Book, and he was a clergyman at Canterbury Cathedral, and his work went through numerous editions as well. But as well as having those who appreciated the Book of Common Prayer, its breadth and its depth and its historical value, and its being a continuation of the tradition of prayer of the Western Church, there are also those who were critics during this 18th century. That is to say, people like the Reverend Samuel Clarke, an Anglican clergyman, wrote and attacked not just the prayer book, but also the need for an organized church, the need for belief in the Trinity, and for the formulation of creeds. He suggested that these things were not necessary. There was also an anti-subscription movement in England in the early part of the century, that is, those within the church who thought that it was too harsh on the nonconformists, the dissenters, and the Presbyterians, that they were banned from public office simply because they didn't worship according to the Book of Common Prayer. And that was an undermining of the status of the prayer book within the society and within the nation. Also, there was a new ism that came about at this period of time, known as Deism. And it wasn't a grouping within the church, but it was a new way of looking at the world, a new outlook on man and God and the world and the relationship between those things. In Deism, the attitude of Deism was one where human reason was extremely highly valued. And it was human reason which would be the judge and the arbiter of what was true, what was right, what was necessary, and what had to be adhered to. And so human reason became the measure of all. And when that attitude got turned on the Christian faith, it was often found that the doctrine of the Trinity didn't make much sense because, of course, you know, if you do your numbers, 1 plus 1 plus 1 doesn't add up to 1, but to 3. And so there's a great doubt in the doctrine of the Trinity. So to the notion of the Incarnation, that God, the Creator, would come down and live as one of us, was something which there was a great deal of doubt cast upon. And the very concept of revelation is something that was scorned as well within deist circles. So there were many obstacles both to the faith and to the particular Anglican expression of it as found in the Book of Common Prayer. This period of time and these attitudes led to 3 different reactions in the early part of the 18th century. The first one is known generally as latitudinarianism. Now that's a big word which simply means the latitude men. That is to say, those who had the idea that, well, you know, we shouldn't be too particular about things, and surely Christianity is a broad tent which can encompass all sorts of different ideas and denominations, not just the Church of England. And these latitude men included 2 archbishops of Canterbury and other very popular bishops and influential men. And under the guise of charity, they wanted to tolerate all sorts of different views about the Christian faith. It often issued in practical concerns an attitude towards the faith and the behavior of the clergy, where they preached long, dry, boring, moralizing sermons. There wasn't any zest or any zeal to their faith at all. Then there was another reaction, and this is known as the High Church reaction. And that attitude within the church was one where men said, no, the Reformed Catholic version of the faith, as we find in the prayer book, is something which is a continuation of Western spirituality. The church is both Protestant and Reformed, but also it's Catholic in its background. And these individuals had a high reverence for Holy Scripture and its reading, a high reverence for the sacraments, especially Holy Baptism and Holy Communion, a high reverence for holy orders, bishops, priests, and deacons, and also they were increasingly interested in devotion and love of neighbor, of putting the faith to work. Then there was the third group or reaction, which are known generally as the evangelicals. They wanted to breathe new life into the church, into the personal faith of parishioners and clergy, and they preached the gospel as being sincere and devout, and they preached the gospel as something which had to be lived. Now, connected to the evangelicals within the church were also the Wesleyans. That is to say, the two Wesley brothers, John and Charles, started out as Anglicans, Anglican clergy, studied at Oxford, along with another fellow in the name of George Whitefield, and they preached and they underwent various stages of their understanding of the faith, eventually coming to the point where they thought that each individual had to have a emotional, sensible conversion moment and experience. And then they started preaching that version of the gospel. They were soon banned from the pulpits in London. They preached outdoors. They went to the New World and preached. And eventually the Wesleyans moved on and became, indirectly and not purposefully, the founders of the Methodist movement and the Methodist Church. One of the brothers, of course, wrote many hymns. It was John and Charles, but they couldn't be contained within the confines of a rather stale Anglican church at the time, and so they broke out of its boundaries and ended up forming what became a new denomination, modern Methodism, and it was a loss to the Church of England. As I mentioned, the Wesley brothers and also Whitefield went to North America as part of their experience and their preaching. And that brings me to the next necessary thing to speak about the 18th century, the movement of Anglicanism and prayer book Anglicanism to the New World. And this was mainly as a result of the work of one particular man, a fellow by the name of Thomas Bray, who in 1701 founded the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the SPG, which was a quasi-official missionary organization within the established church in England. And this organization helped bring the Anglican version of the faith to the 13 disparate and different colonies along the Atlantic seaboard of what later became the United States. And each of the colonies was very different. In Virginia, for instance, the Church of England was established, and it was self-supporting there. Taxes were raised by the colony to support the church. In Pennsylvania, it was a different situation altogether, because it was founded by Quakers who fled the old country to form a free society in the New World, their own state. And in the New England states to the north, they were the inheritors of the Puritan heritage from the Mayflower, and there the Congregationalist Church, which is what Puritanism morphed into, was the controlling denomination. It taxed all members of the state to support the established Congregationalist Church in those particular states, like Connecticut. And they even taxed the Anglicans who were in Connecticut. Now, the American Revolution, as we know, transpired in the 1780s. The American colonies revolted against England. They fought the war, the Revolutionary War, and they won. And they became independent, the 13 new colonies or American states. And that included a diversity of Anglicans spread from the north in Boston area all the way down to the south, and very different expressions of Anglicanism. And the expressions of Anglicanism that existed in the 13 colonies mirrored at least the diversity that existed in England, from latitude men to high churchmen in the north to evangelicals. And so the new church, in the new United Church, couldn't retain the Anglican name or Church of England, so they came up with a new name, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. And this also meant that they felt that they had to create a new prayer book. And so they heavily edited and changed the existing 1662 prayer book. There was a proposed 1786 book, and this was rather a significant alteration, to say the least. They agreed with the Puritans of old by taking the sign of the cross out of the baptism service. Also, references to regeneration in the baptism service were removed in this proposed book. And then they altered the 39 Articles of Religion, not just to take the things which only pertain to England out, but also to alter some of the doctrinal content. They also, amazingly, omitted completely the Nicene Creed and the Athanasian Creed. As we know, there are three creeds in the 1662 prayer book: the Apostles, the Nicene, and the Athanasian. The proposed 1786 book dropped two of them, and they omitted the descent into hell clause out of the Apostles' Creed. This was a radical departure from the traditional 1662 prayer book, and Samuel Seabury, the first bishop in the new American states, ordained in Scotland, he and his clergy in colonial Connecticut, who were high church Anglicans, could not accept all these changes and couldn't use or join the rest of the church that was using or proposed to use the 1786 book. And so there was a compromise attempted, and in 1789 there was the New American Prayer Book, which was in use for basically the next century. In this 1789 book, the Nicene Creed came back, but not the Athanasian Creed. And the Nicene Creed came back optionally within the communion service. The descent of Christ into hell also came back, but there was an optional phrase that could be replaced in it. Amazingly, for an age that had Holy Communion very seldom, the Venite was shortened in the morning prayer service, and so too was the Benedictus in the morning prayer service. Amazingly, in evening prayer, the Magnificat was dropped completely, "My soul doth magnify the Lord," and the Nunc Dimittis, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace," was omitted entirely from the evening prayer service. Also, interestingly, the three clauses in the introductory paragraphs of the marriage service explaining the three reasons for marriage, namely the procreation of children, the avoidance of fornication, and the mutual support and society that one ought to have for the other, was completely omitted from their marriage service, and that remained so for a long time afterwards. Nonetheless, the 1789 prayer book was just barely acceptable to Samuel Seabury, Bishop Seabury, and his clergy in Connecticut, and it became the New American Prayer Book of 1789. We shall see next week in the next talk that this was not fully acceptable to the American church in the next century, and they would alter their book yet again. But that's a story for another day. Thank you, and goodbye for now. God bless.